About 10 years ago during the summer, I got really interested in Marvel Comics. So I started watching all the things I could get my hands on. So, watching all the movies, TV shows that you could find on Netflix, and even reading the comic books, which for me actually just meant going on YouTube and typing in Marvel audio comics. And a close friend of mine that I'd grown up with had done the same thing. And over the course of the year, we developed a very strong interest in comic books and superheroes that we'd had since we were kids, and just sort of picked that back up. And in fact, we actually made like Instagram pages as well about that. I'll throw it up if I can find it. And maybe about a year or so in, during just leading up to the summer, we were thinking about things that we could do that were really interesting. And one of the characters that we were really interested in at the time, about 9 years ago, was Iron Man. And for anyone who was a teenager pre AI who watched Iron Man, there's probably a good chance that you might have thought about Jarvis being really interesting and possibly building it, and we were no different. So the plan was simple: that I would go ahead and try to build the AI portion, and then if I could do that, then he would try to help, and we would work together trying to build the suit. And well, to be honest, I had no idea where to even start. So I started Googling around, trying to do research, and I didn't really have a technical background. Like, I did a little bit of Python in school, but I wasn't really good at it. So, over that summer, I tried to just Google around and try to get as much information as I could. But the more I read, the less I understood even less than when I started, because I just didn't even know what I was reading, let alone even how to read it. And what I ended up doing is I ended up just kind of keeping it on the backlog of things to do. And then maybe about a year and a half later, I ended up actually coming across a course from Andrew Ang about machine learning. And by that point, I'd had some level of proficiency in maths, and I really enjoyed calculus, and I was pretty okay at statistics. I didn't enjoy it, but I was okay at it, and I could understand it. And, well, spoiler alert, by the way, machine learning actually has statistics. So when I realized I still wanted to get into machine learning some way, shape, or form, but I just didn't know how to. And I realized that programming was just going to be way too out of my depth because I didn't have any real programming experience. So I figured the best place I could start was on the maths. So I started going through that course, started making notes, and I completed a decent chunk of it. But then I had to sort of put that on the back pedal for a while I focused back on my exams. Then maybe about a year and a half later, I ended up picking back programming. I ended up picking up programming again, but this time I had actually made a firm commitment to learning. So actually learning programming from start, I guess not, there's never really a finish, is there, with programming, but start to being full stack basically. And after a few months of actually making that commitment to learning programming, I was able to actually build a full stack application. Now, I wouldn't say it was anything like enterprise grade, but it was enough to kind of just build something that was usable, pretty much. And guess what happened? During this period where I was learning how to code, something happened that shook the course of the world. And during that time, I decided to pick back up where I left off because I'd forgotten most of the things that I had learned about machine learning beforehand, as you would if you haven't touched anything for a couple of years. So I started picking back up from where I left off, and then I kind of also sort of stopped afterwards again and started focusing more on the programming side of things. Then fast forward another couple of years, and I decided again to pick back up where I had left off. So to try to make things stick a little bit more, I actually started writing essays. And I'd been writing essays about philosophy at that time, but I figured I could just translate that sort of ability to write into just my notes. And I never actually published any of these, but I figured it would actually help me just learn. And around this sort of time, I'd spent a couple of years programming, so I figured I'd be okay if I actually did decide to try to build something with AI. Even if it wasn't great, it was okay, just something to get the ball rolling. So I started playing around a little bit with Keras models at that time, with TensorFlow, and that's how. And I was just following tutorials online just to kind of get the ball rolling, because I still wanted to build Jarvis. I just had no idea how to actually do it. And AI is now exploding in terms of public awareness, and with that comes hype. We're seeing a lot more people getting involved in conversations regarding AI, which is really good for the space. But there can also be a lot of confusion that can happen because there's just so much noise and so many opinions to sort of go and sift around. On the one side, you've got the extreme predictions that paint this future that is extremely doomeristic, that everything is going to be automated away, and that there's just not going to be anything for people to do. And then on the flip side, you've got people who are still skeptical about AI, which generally is becoming fewer and fewer, but as the days go by, but you still have those group of people, and then somewhere in between you've got people who are also building within the space as well. So I wanted to share a few observations that I've seen in the AI space, as well as predictions for what I think is likely going to happen and what you can do about that as well. And also, if you wanted to also keep your ears close to the ground and be a part of that conversation about what's happening with AI, or just observe what people are saying about it, the best place to honestly go is probably on X, and just follow as many founders as you can building an AI, anyone talking about AI, including VCs as well who are funding AI, and you'll be able to just see exactly what kind of things are happening, because there's a lot of things that happen pretty much every single day. And being able to have a close ear to the ground can certainly help to inform future decisions that you choose to make. Observation number one: top performers are the ones who are capturing the most gains from AI. So if we imagine an organization to be represented in the form of, say, a normal distribution, on the right side, on the right tail, you have the top performers. On the left tail, you have the low performers. And in the 95%, you have the median. You have the middle. You say these are the average sort of performers. And on the right side of the middle, you have people who are just above average, people on the left, slightly below average. Now, I'm going to associate a higher leverage with top performers, which isn't always true, but is probably going to be a fair assumption. Now, people who are in higher leverage positions and are top performers still have to do some level of low leverage work. So, what they are generally doing is they're taking the low leverage tasks that they would have to do and automating it away. And as a result, they can have more time to focus on inputs inside of higher leverage tasks, which actually increases the value of their output. And that goes for people who are just below that right tail as well, or trailing into that right tail. On the flip side, on the left tail, where you have people who don't necessarily have to do things that are higher leverage and are just more on the execution layer, a lot of their work is quite repetitive and is quite manual. And as a result, you're seeing that their work can actually be automated by using AI, which can actually put them in a bit of a tough spot, because then they have to find ways to add additional value outside of what they signed on for their work. Observation slash prediction number two, and that is that we are seeing a lot more SMBs kickstarted. Now, regardless of whatever the sort of motivations might be, whether it's just sort of trying to build something as an additional income stream or building something out of passion, there's a lot more people who are actually building businesses from AI and there's a lot more small businesses starting up. And the reason why that's actually the case is because the cost of building has fallen down drastically. So, traditionally, with software applications specifically, you would have two types of applications. You'd have something called CRUD, create, read, update, delete application. So you could think of this like, say, a social media application. So you would create a post, for example. You might watch, or I guess read somebody else's post. You might make edits, updating your posts, or you might just delete a post, right? And on the flip side, you have API first applications, which basically means you're basically using code from other people's technologies in order to increase the value and increase the feature density inside of your own application. Now, what we've seen specifically over the past year or so is that there's been a massive amount of growth in tools that can actually build CRUD applications. In fact, with a lot of the tools that have just been exploding lately, you can actually just feed a simple prompt into the application, and it will print out an entire front end application that is a CRUD application. What this means is that the actual barrier for the skill set required in order to build these applications has effectively become commoditized, or is becoming commoditized. And while it's good that you're actually seeing a lot more people take the initiative and that the barrier to someone actually building something is a lot lower, the downside about that is you are going to see products that necessarily aren't fully well built out flood the marketplace. And then as a result, you might end up seeing that you might see a lot more people saturating inside of markets, where there perhaps wasn't any competitors previously, and a lot more people are going to be entering different markets with different solutions. So you are going to see a lot more competition, and we're already starting to see it now because the cost for building has actually gone down drastically. Observation slash prediction number three, and that is that the companies that are going to stand out are the ones that have a great product but also have great distribution. Now, there's been a rhetoric that's been pretty widespread across the tech side on X that now distribution is the moat, right? And I feel like there's kind of been sort of like a back and forth almost, right, over the past God knows how many years, where before it was about whoever screamed the loudest won. Then after that period, you have a period where people were saying that you need to have the best product to succeed, and now you're kind of back to this whole situation where you're saying distribution is the thing that's going to determine success. But if you look at any company that's actually been able to achieve scale, they've been able to do it because they've been able to make their customers happy, and they've built a product that was able to help their customers achieve their desired outcomes. But they were also able to reach out to people at scale and build some form of a leverage. And kind of expanding on that as well as the sort of last point as well, that really speaking, the product itself needs to be able to drive real value. And it and that can be measured in a couple of different ways, and that can be structured in different ways. So for example, we're seeing this massive rise of outcome-based pricing. So what that means is, for example, the pricing structure aligns exactly with specific outcomes that can be delivered for customers. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can also have a standard fee that kind of goes across to all customers, and you're still actually able to demonstrate that you can deliver real value to the end customer. And speaking of delivering results, if you are looking to book more meetings with potential customers, then I'll personally walk you through how you can actually do that with an AI sales clone that can find potential buyers with their contact information, do deep research on them, as well as write personalized outreach to them on multiple channels, so that way you can actually build up that top of funnel. Link down below in the description, as well as the first comment. Prediction slash observation number 4, which kind of ties into like the second point that I mentioned earlier, is that we're going to start to see a lot more companies with smaller headcounts achieve larger valuations, and we're already seeing it now. But we're actually going to start to see the first 10-person billion-dollar company, and it probably will happen in the not too distant future. If you look at companies like, say, Cursor, for example, or Lovable, where they've been able to scale their revenue exponentially to the same size as companies with 10 times or 50 times the amount of people, but they've been able to do that with such constrained human capital. So if you look at, say, Cursor, for example, they're at $500 million in annually recurring revenue, and they are at a valuation of $9.9 billion, and they have a team of less than 50 people. Same with Lovable. They've just announced the other day that they got to 75 million in ARR, and that's happened within the past 6 months, over the course of 6 months, from 0 to 75 million in ARR, and they're a team of around 50 people as well. Compared to companies which were 10 times larger than them, who could potentially be seen as competitors, a lot more is getting done with a lot less. And Sam Altman made this prediction a while back, so this isn't necessarily this is not something that's coming from me. This is something that Sam Altman had talked about a couple of years ago, where he said that there's some sort of an internal bet that he has with his friends that they're going to see the first 10-person when they're going to see the first 10-person billion-dollar company, and even possibly even the first 1-person billion-dollar company. Now, the 1-person one seems a little bit difficult because, like, say, example, if you get a flu, well, what are you going to do, right? Like, you're going to be out of action for a few days, so then there's the company sort of stop. But 10-person, right? If you have a flu, for example, you've got 9 other people that can sort of step in, just try to help manage responsibilities and workloads. So we are starting to see a lot more resourcefulness happening within companies, and a lot more can be done with a lot less. Observation 5, and this is a bit of a juicy one, but with a lot of AI companies, there is actually a lot of churn. Now, this isn't something that's really publicized, right? Like, with a lot of companies that are blitzscaling revenue, you often see it constantly online that this company has achieved X amount of revenue in Y amount of time, and then they've got Z valuation, right? They're generating millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And we're seeing kind of the flashy publicized picture of that. But what's not really talked about is how much churn that these companies are actually expecting. Now, I'm not going to go out here and start calling out companies saying, oh, this company's getting X amount of churn, this company's getting Y amount of churn. That's not right for me to do. I think that, anyone who is trying to build an AI company is trying to figure out the best way to reduce their churn, right? Like any company. But it does bring up a really, really interesting conversation, because if you look at traditional SaaS before, the accepted range of churn was probably was between 3% to, on the high end, maybe 8%. But with a lot of these AI companies, they're minimum about 10%, and on the really high end, which a lot of companies are seeing, is 90% churn, which is quite high. So it does bring up an interesting conversation as to how this is going to impact valuations as time progresses, right, compared to traditional SaaS. Not to mention what the exit multiples could even look like for AI companies, because traditionally with SaaS, you could expect anywhere between a 6x on the low end to a 10x exit multiple on the high end. But with AI companies, for a while, we did see that the exit multiple was a lot higher. But if churn is also really, really high as well, it's going to be an interesting conversation to see how exiting conversations actually look like when a company is trying to be acquired. What does the valuation sort of look like? What does the exit multiples look like? And it does highlight a really, really important problem that needs to be solved for a lot of AI companies, which is retention. How do you actually ensure that your customers are happy? And this isn't just for a specific type of company as well. This is for product-led companies that are AI based, as well as for higher ticket enterprise AI companies as well. There's a lot of churn that's actually occurring behind the scenes that people don't want to advertise. Some companies have been kind of caught out for this. Have been caught out for having having insane amounts of churn, and it does highlight the importance of retention in order to build a very long-term sustainable business. Observation number 6, and that is that companies are moving away from hiring executioners into hiring strategists. So before, let's say you're at a large company and you had to execute on a specific project, that would normally generally take multiple teams multiple weeks to complete. What we're now seeing is that companies are able to complete the same objective with fewer people who are acting as strategists and planners, and leaving AI to be the executioner. And what this means is that instead of taking several weeks or several months to complete a specific set of tasks or projects, it would mean that that can be accomplished within a few days, if not even a few hours. In fact, I recently saw that Goldman Sachs had been experimenting with AI in terms of building an S1 filing which is basically the filing that's used for a company that's going public, meaning that normal individuals can buy shares into a company rather than having private investors. And what they found is that 90% of the S1 filing was actually completed by AI, which means that the remaining 10% was just done by humans, and that took a few hours, which would previously take multiple people several weeks to actually complete. Now, from a company perspective, that's incredible because you're able to move a lot faster, you're able to be a lot more efficient. However, that also does mean that there is reduced headcount. Another example that I'll give is that recently Microsoft laid off 7,000 people from their staff. And some of these people had been there for 15 to 20 years. A bulk of their career had been spent at Microsoft. And it's rumored that the reason that they were laid off is because the majority of their function could have been completed by AI. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. However, if that is true, then that does mean that people who are in these sorts of positions where previously, maybe 5 years ago, where you would have a certain skill set that was in high demand, that is now becoming slowly commoditized. That does mean that there has to be some form of a shift for people who are trying to have any form of job security, from just focusing on just pure execution into focusing into some form of leverage. And from a business perspective, it does make sense why companies would do this, because you can achieve the exact same objective at a lower cost, which means that your profitability is going to be larger. And that's ultimately what companies have to do, is they have to serve their shareholders. However, from a human perspective, it is a bit tougher because you've got people who have spent a long time developing specific skill sets that are now readily becoming commoditized because of AI. And for people who are being made redundant, they're finding it tougher in the current job market to find new employment, because they spent most of their career on the execution front rather than on the strategic front. Observation number 7, and that is that focus remains a very powerful force multiplier. However, we are seeing a massive trend in companies going more horizontal in their approach. Now, it's been a timeless piece of philosophy almost, that if you channel your focus into only one thing or very few things, you're going to get really, really good at that. And for a lot of companies, especially a lot of vertical software companies, they've been able to scale exponentially as a result of just having that core focus. However, one of the things that we're also starting to see more and more now is that because a lot of applications can be kind of broad spectrum, a lot of companies are starting to move more horizontally to serve different industries. Now, what that means long term has to kind of be has to honestly just be observed and and we just have to see what happens. However, what I am sort of seeing at the moment is that companies who are very, very focused in one specific customer profile will generally be able to have better retention rates. However, the growth rate is a lot slower. On the flip side, companies that are more horizontal generally are getting a better growth rate in terms of how much revenue they're adding. However, their retention rate is a lot worse compared to the more focused companies. So we have to see if that trend continues, but that's pretty much what I'm seeing in terms of how companies are sort of operating in specific markets. So those were a few observations as well as predictions of what I'm kind of seeing in AI at the moment. But what can you do about that? Well, the first thing is to focus on measurable outcomes. Now, whether you're the owner of a business or maybe you're in a client-facing position, the best thing that you can do with any customers that you are working with is to communicate with them as frequently as possible and to directly attribute your value to the end outcome that they were trying to achieve. So whether that's, say, saving time or generating more revenue or anything like that that you can directly attribute from where they were to where they are now and attributing the changes to yourself and your product or your company and the service or product that you're offering. And in addition to that, making sure that you are communicating that frequently with that end customer so that way they also know. It's not enough to actually just deliver that value. It's also, you have to also take the extra initiative to just communicate with your customer to show the actual progress that they're making as a direct result of you. The second thing, and this is for people who are finding themselves in lower leverage positions where a lot of their work can be generally automated away or are generally doing very repetitive, very similar work. And that is to find ways to build some form of leverage. And that can be internally with the company. So by taking the initiative and being proactive in finding additional ways that you can add value to a company where you become indispensable. But that can also mean additional leverage as well. So developing other skill sets, maybe building an audience online, building some form of leverage so that way you are secure. Number 3, if you do sell a higher ticket offering, make sure that you have a really strong backend to support any customers, because because it's not enough to just get the customer through the door, you want to retain them as well. And the best way to retain them is to have a really strong customer success backend so that you're able to deepen relationships with your customer and you're able to go above and beyond to deliver value for your customer, as well as making sure that you're actually focusing on measuring achievable outcomes, but showing that you are available, showing that you are able to deliver value for your client, and taking the extra step, going the extra mile to help and support your customers and make them feel really, really valued and deepen that relationship. Point number 4, and that is if you are building some form of a software product, it's still a good idea to learn how to code and develop some level of technical expertise, especially on the back end. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can use other tools to help you build prototypes. You can build even a full stack, I guess not really a full stack, it's more of a front end application, a CRUD application. You can do that with a lot of these applications. But if you are trying to build something a little bit more technically complex or something a little bit more feature rich, then you're probably going to have to develop a back-end system and a back-end architecture to make sure you can actually support the front end. And as a result, you should probably learn how to write back-end code, right? And look, there is a good chance that within the next couple of years, that's also going to be made redundant. But until then, at least it's definitely still a good idea to develop some level of technical insight. Number 5, and this is probably a little bit of a controversial one as well, and it's very difficult, but try not to believe the hype that you're seeing constantly, because it does kind of demoralize you a bit, especially if you are a founder and you're trying to build anything and you're seeing all these companies that are blowing up crazy in terms of their revenue numbers and you're not. You might end up feeling like you're doing something wrong or you're not good enough, or you might have a bunch of these different thoughts. You might feel these thoughts of inadequacy, but you also have to remember that maybe not all of them. Some of these companies are actually genuinely are exploding like crazy, and that is a real thing. However, for quite a lot of these companies who are, advertising a lot of these larger scale revenue numbers, it's not because of their front end, it's their back end. And what I mean by that is they're doing things that are just not publicly advertised in terms of generating extra and generating most of their revenue. They could be doing enterprise deals behind the scenes, which are worth tens of millions of dollars, but they're just not posting that, right? And that's nobody's fault, right? That's not the founder's fault. They're just sharing what their revenue numbers are because they would probably want to collate more investor interest and they want to be able to raise their next round, right? And that's completely understandable. And they also don't have to advertise how they make their money. That's not their problem. It's not anybody's fault. But when you are sort of seeing these sorts of hyper growth stories, it is also just important to bear in mind that everyone is kind of on their own journey. You might be on yours, they're on theirs, and a lot of things that you see are just not what a lot of things that you see on the surface are just not actually what is the reality of what is happening, right? You're going to see companies that are doing, say, $10 million a year, right? With I'm just making up an example. Let's say $10 million a year in annual revenue, and let's say it's like a PLG model, meaning that it's like a self-serve sort of thing, and you might be thinking, wow, how are they getting so many users? And sure, they actually might be getting a lot of people on the front end who are just like, they might just be doing a lot of outreach, for example. They might have specific strategies in place and they are driving a lot of traffic and a lot of eyeballs to the website and getting good conversion rates. Like, that's actually a real thing. However, it's also possible that they are doing things behind the scenes that aren't necessarily public. For example, if you look at any company that is, say, within one of these, I guess you could say one of these hyper growth companies, they will generally have some sort of an enterprise plan. And as a result, those enterprise plans and those contracts can be worth a substantial amount of money. And that could be making up most of their revenue. I'm not saying whether that is or whether that isn't true, but that is definitely the case for certain companies that are within that sort of hyperscale situation. But also, that doesn't mean that you can't be one of those people as well. So if you look at those stories and you see that as inspiration, that you also can go out and you can go and build incredible things and you can have that level of success, that's great. That's a really great belief to have, and you should absolutely believe that, and you absolutely can do that. It can happen to anybody. Good things can happen. Luck, for example, can happen. You could post something, you could build something, post about it on, say, X, and it could blow up and you could get a ton of users and a ton of revenue that way. Like, that's a real thing and that can really happen. But if you're seeing a lot of these stories of hypergrowth and you're not feeling particularly encouraged, or if you feel inadequate and you're not using that to sort of motivate you or drive you, and it's just kind of discouraging you, then try not to sort of let that bog you down and just try to separate yourself away from that sort of situation, because everyone's kind of on their own sort of path in trying to build technology. Ultimately, if you just go out there and you try to build something really valuable and that solves a problem, ideally for yourself, but if not for yourself, then for other people and they find it valuable, and you're just doing that repeatedly, you're going to be okay. Point number 6, and again, slightly a little bit unproven whether this is the right strategy or not, but I suspect that it is, and that is to potentially focus on retention first before blitzscaling. And the reason why I say that is just out of a principle of, say, a leaky bucket. And this is something that I kind of learned from an Alex Hormozy video a couple years ago. And what he described was, if you imagine like you have a bucket, right, and it has some holes in it, right, you can add a lot more water to that bucket, right, just to keep it full. But it's going to continuously keep leaking water, and you'll constantly keep having to fill the bucket unless you plug the holes. And I feel like growth is the same way. Like, if you don't actually fix the retention issue, then you're just going to be in this perpetual cycle where you have to keep finding new businesses or new customers to basically keep buying from you in order to grow, rather than fixing the fundamental problems that are causing churn. Additionally, if you do end up focusing on blitz scaling too early without really caring about churn, without actually caring about retention, what can end up happening is, if you don't have a large enough total addressable market, you may end up just potentially burning reputation. You may end up putting a sour taste in people's mouths about the product itself, and that can hurt you in the long term. And if you don't take care of your customers early on and you're not really hands-on with them, you're not really trying to go above and beyond to deliver an exceptional experience for them, that's going to end up long term, that's going to end up causing, I suspect anyway, it's long term, it's end up going to backfire on you, rather than just taking care of your customers and then growing as a result of taking care of your customers. And point number 7 is that you should assume that AI is going to get better over time and more advanced over time. So whether you're running your own business, whether you're an individual contributor of a business, if you take that fundamental assumption that AI is going to get better and models are going to get more advanced, then you can plan your future strategy accordingly. So that way you are actually being able to be more future proof, and you're not being reactive, you're kind of being more proactive. And look, in the short term, it's super easy to listen to the cynics and the pessimists and say, hey, look, all of these models, they can't do XYZ, they can't replicate certain things. And look, in the short term, cynics and pessimists and realists, they get to be right. But in the long term, optimists and the people who are building get to win.